where I test to with the right there. So
And helps keeps it more uniform.
what do you do? Just hear them to make sure it goes deep?
It's not like we're brushing on something. It'll be mic level.
I've overcome sickness from not doing that. So
What's that?
all it is keeping me awake. Like that's been a really hard area.
I know we can only try. Whenever there's a pocket asking to put in the slack, I should have looked at that because we're going to get an email about that. You know, anyone cares about it.
Give it 1 second here. We good? Good. Exactly. We should have warned you. Sorry. I kind of like the tables better anyway, but it's kind of so. All right. Am I good to go? Yes. I know. All right. I think I'm good to go, but I just want to make sure I'm. Michael, am I good to go? Am I good to go? Yep. Yeah, okay, good. All right, good morning. I'm John Fortier. I'm the director of the Democracy Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are here with a panel whose title explains it all. Well, actually, I have to look at it. The elections. What happened? It's nice to be direct about things. We have a panel of real election experts, both who analyze and are in the field. And we're here to really talk about what happened last Tuesday, or is still going on as we're still counting ballots, and what it means for the future. So let me just jump right in, introduce our panelists. We'll all say a little something about the election, an early 5 minutes or so. We'll have some more discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll certainly open up to your questions. So to my left is Anna Greenberg, who is the managing partner of Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner Research. She has been a pollster working in the field, working for candidates for I won't say 20-ish years, and was very active here as well. Has also been really a partner with us on several projects, including the States of Change project. To Anna's left is Nathan Gonzalez, who is the editor and publisher of Inside Elections. Nathan runs the place, but has been there for quite a while, and it was formerly known as the Rothenberg Report, and is really one of the leading experts on election prognostication, and I will say knows a lot about general trends and polls, but also you really do an amazing job of interviewing lots and lots of these candidates. You have met more of these candidates and people who will be coming to Congress than I think anyone else on the panel.
That's a blessing.
Yes. Mark Melman is the president and CEO of the Melman Group. Again, a leading pollster here in Washington, working on the Democratic side. Also has been a partner here at BPC, doing some polling on polarization and our commitment on political reform, and a regular guest, so we're happy to have him back. And then Henry Olson, senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, former colleague of mine at AEI, and also an author of a couple of books. One I will mention, I'll mention both. One, the working class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism, an interesting subject given we are talking about what the role of blue-collar voters are in the Republican Party. And then secondly, the four faces of the Republican Party. And I will assure you these four faces are not these four faces. There are other four faces, but really looking at some of the different factions within the Republican Party. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to say a few words myself. I'm going to turn to Anna. I'll just go right down the line. So a couple things about this election that I just want to put on the table. One, voter turnout. I am one who's always a bit skeptical when one says this is going to be the most exciting election, the highest turnout election that we can imagine. I'm even one who watches early voting relatively carefully and is cautious about that. People try to draw a lot of lessons from the early results that come in from early voting, how many people are going to vote and what it means for each party. That being said, this was an incredible high turnout election. Just to put it in perspective, since the post-1970 election, which was the last election where 18-year-olds were not allowed to vote in the midterm elections, the highest election results we've seen for voter turnout is 42.1% of eligible voters. We are going to be very high. The numbers are still coming in. We're clearly at about 45% now. I think by the time the numbers come in, we may be more 47%, 46, 47, maybe 48%. This is an incredible jump up in the number of people who will vote at a midterm election. Second, not a surprise, and I think we all talked about this being a good Democratic year, as it often is for the party out of the White House. But in several areas, Democrats did extremely well. One, the House of Representatives, where the numbers are still coming in, but certainly 35-seat gain, or perhaps even up to closer to 40 for Democrats. State legislatures, people aren't watching this carefully, and those numbers aren't all in, but big gain, 250, maybe up to 300 seats out of the 10,000 or so seats that we have. That compares pretty well for other wave elections that we've seen. Republicans gained about 900 seats during the two elections in the Obama, or all of the elections in the Obama administration. Some of that was kind of a realignment, but a good gain. Democrats gained 7 governorships. And of course, I think there was a blue direction to the election, even in the Senate, but that was counteracted by the fact that there was good territory that Republicans were playing on. A couple of other things. There's a way in which this election was a very good one for Democrats who moved into a lot of Republican territory. But it wasn't as if Democrats regained kind of the old seats that they used to have in very conservative places. They won lots of seats in seats that Hillary Clinton had won, in seats that Donald Trump had won narrowly. Only 5 seats in the House that Donald Trump had won more than 50% in. And also no seats that Donald Trump had won 55% in a district did they get a seat. If you contrast that back with 2006, where Democrats had a very good midterm comeback, they were taking back some places that were really quite surprising. They won seats in Idaho and in the Deep South. So they did quite well, but they're not winning the seats that are in the deepest red. One other obvious note, I think, is that Democrats did very well in the suburbs, and you could just sort of list off the cities which suburban seats went in the Democratic direction, from Southern California, maybe Salt Lake City, Denver, Tucson, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Chicago, Oklahoma City, Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, not in North Carolina, but Charleston, Michigan, D.C., Richmond, Virginia Beach, New Jersey. I may be missing one, but lots of places. It wasn't as if it was a simply regional suburban phenomenon, suburban districts across the country. I will say just one brief thing about the Midwest, because I think others will say more, and that is just I think both parties have been crowing a bit about the Midwest. Oh, Democrats, they're doing better than people thought, and maybe that's a sign for Trump. And Trump, I think, can point also Republicans to some places that they did well as well. So I think the Midwest is still obviously a battlefield for the future. Last thing I will note on the alignment of the seats. The Acela corridor, or the Northeast, has been moving Democratic in a very, very significant way for a while, but that continued in a big way. We don't know what's going to happen in the Upper Maine district in Maine 2. Could go either way, depending. It may depend on the new ranked choice voting system. But if the Republican there were to lose, there would be no seats in New England, no House seats in New England for Democrats. None really in the New York area except for Long Island. One in eastern Pennsylvania and the Philadelphia parts, except for the maybe very, very distant suburbs. None in Delaware, one in Maryland, and none in the D.C. suburbs, except maybe a finger or two of some rural districts which get up into the exurbs. So really the whole corridor is turned blue in terms of the House. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll just again tease this so we can talk about it more, is that we do have some elections outstanding. The big ones are Senate and gubernatorial ones, but there's still some House races outstanding. Some of that has to do with the fact that we have become slower and slower about counting ballots because we have states that are doing more vote by mail. We have more provisional ballots. And so some places there are still a lot of votes out there, especially California. And that's one of the reasons the turnout numbers are not all in. On the big races, I do think the Georgia governor's race is probably the one that's least likely to change. Stacey Abrams is going to have to get a decent number of ballots just to get to the runoff, which again I think is hard given the number of ballots out there. Florida, we've seen, is moving. I think their Republicans still could easily win both of those races, but it is a little more uncertain. And then Arizona, you see that at least as of now, Kristen Sinema has pulled ahead of initial results. That is still a pretty wide open place because there are so many ballots outstanding. And the places where once we get to a point where we're nearly certified or we have the ballots in place, it's very hard to move things very much in a recount. But when we're still actually counting ballots and a lot of election results out there, it is still a lot of fair game for change. So I'm going to go there, and I'm going to turn to Anna.
Thanks. So we were sort of bemoaning back in the green room that it's hard to tell anybody anything they don't know about what happened in this election. And I assume anybody who's come to this presentation is a political junkie and has read 538 and the Upshot and the New York Times polls. And so, and now we have this wonderful summary of what happened. So I'm sort of thinking about what can I say that maybe is either not necessarily a different take, but some dynamics that I think have a lot of implications for 2020 coming out of this election. The first thing I would say is that people have focused a lot on sort of what happened in the districts and in the states, and a little less on what Democrats actually did. It wasn't just luck that there was a blue wave, and I do think it was a blue wave. I think that unfortunately, because of the map on election night, because of Florida and Georgia being sort of the first two states, there was this kind of, I thought Democrats were going to do well, coming on. I was forced to watch cable news because I was in my office. I don't generally watch it, but I had CNN on. It was, making me nuts because they were just so focused on the Senate, on those early states, and all this amazing stuff's happening, and there's lots of stuff that hasn't been counted yet. And so there was this, well, it's a disappointing night for Democrats. It was the first narrative that came out on election night from at least cable news. But I think now you've seen various people like Nate Cohn talk about the fact that really once you look at all of these things and you put the pieces together, it really was a blue wave. And I just want to suggest that the blue wave was not an accident. Certainly, the fundamentals matter. So if a party out of power tends to do better. We know what Trump's approval ratings were, et cetera. But Democrats actually ran a very disciplined and focused campaign. I think a lot of it was a reaction to 2016, and particularly at the House level. There was a push that came from Washington out to the races that we were going to make it about Trump, and that a vote for a Republican was a vote for Trump. That was not a winning strategy in 2016 because Trump actually won. But it was also not terribly believable or plausible in lots of places, and it was immensely frustrating for those of us actually working on those races, being told that that's going to be a big thrust of what you're going to talk about in the election. And we can get into the dynamics of how you get told that if you want to later. And I think there was a real step back after 2016, and Democrats said, we got to listen to people and figure out what's really going on here. And there was a lot, and I think that also was a reaction to the Clinton campaign, particularly its hyper focus on data analytics and not actually listening to people. And so there was a real pullback. And so there was a lot of listening. And that is part of how healthcare became the issue that it was in these races. And most of us don't live in battleground districts, and we don't see the ads, but over half of the ads that were run this cycle were about healthcare. And it was also sort of helped along by the gift of the Republicans' attempt to repeal Obamacare and their attempt to pass a bill that didn't pass, both of which were deeply unpopular and really set the choice out very starkly for voters on the issue of health care. And I think the reason why health care was so important and will continue to be important is and it's sort of the counter narrative to this strong economy, which is as the economy does better, unemployment rate historic lows, stock market, finally some wage growth, but not really too much leading up into the election. And there's a sense from the Republicans that we're going to, we've got this strong economy, this is going to be a great argument for us. It's still unaffordable to live, right? And so you can have a booming economy, but if you have a hard time, I'm just dealing right now with my own health insurance, and I'm like, how does anybody deal with this? Where like the things that they're trying, the way they're trying not to cover things, and I do pretty well in life, so like I can't imagine somebody who's really struggling, or a middle-class family that has lots of expenses, how they deal with the way insurance companies are trying to screw people over. And so you have this this dynamic where you have a booming economy and people still really, really struggling to afford the necessities. Healthcare is a necessity, transportation, education. And the thing that I think is really critical, and I think that there's a lot of pundits in Washington and that sort of suggest that Democrats can only run ideological campaigns, right? And that everything is about socialism and Medicare for all, and they're too far left. The campaigns that Democrats won, were pretty non-ideological. They were very, very factual and non-ideological. They were about healthcare costs. They were about the consequences of the Republican tax bill. In contrast, a lot of, in part because the Republicans were stymied by having a lot of first-time candidates, and so there wasn't a lot in terms of opposition research. There wasn't a lot to say about a lot of these candidates. Went hard ideological against Democrats, socialized medicine, et cetera, Pelosi, tax. I worked for Kim Schreier in Washington 8. I'd say 5 of the ads were called Dr. Tax. She's a doctor, Dr. Tax. She's going to raise the state income tax, which of course makes no sense when you're running for federal office. But, and so they were highly, highly ideological. And I actually think that contrast was really important for Democrats winning, because what I heard in focus groups from voters in the year and a half leading up to this election was, we just want people who are going to focus on trying to solve our problems. We don't want ideological fights. We don't want partisan fights. And so I think there was incredible discipline on the Democratic side at every level. It wasn't just congressional races, on sort of having a non-ideological conversation about people's lives and the things that were affecting them, while on the other side there was a highly polarized, highly ideological conversation. And I think that it shows the limitations at the extreme of the Trump kind of base strategy, because I think the late push on border, sending troops to the border, caravan, et cetera, actually had the, there's no question it probably helped with Republican turnout, and Republican turnout was up too, not just Democratic turnout. But there isn't any question that it helped in the end. We saw the late movement in the suburban districts with sort of independents in particular, sort of really just finding it sort of repulsive and really obvious what it was he was doing. So I'm not suggesting it doesn't help him in what he does in red states and in the presidential, but it definitely hurt him here. I was honestly a little bit surprised that there hadn't been more immigration talk earlier in the cycle. When we tested, when we did our baseline polls in our congressional races and our gubernatorial and Senate races, we always test sanctuary city hits, like I work for Governor Wolf, and Philadelphia's a sanctuary city. And those hits were always always tested very strongly against us. And I frankly was surprised that we didn't see more of it. And I think the late hit at the end did them no favors, especially as articulated by Trump. I think they could have actually done something with immigration earlier in the cycle if they'd wanted to, but they didn't. So that I think is a bit of the untold story, if you will, is that the Democratic strategy was focused and disciplined and steady and had the money to do it, while the Republicans, I think, were flailing around and not quite sure how to, and obviously couldn't win these races. Two other things I would say. John mentioned the suburban districts, and there's some great analysis about what happened in the suburbs. I won't go into that. But I do think it's just a flag that is, as a Democrat and as happy as I am about this, it does mean more polarization. Right, and when you talk about the Northeast corridor being all blue, and so as we see population shifts and sorting about where people live, this kind of consolidation of Democrats in these areas does, I think, kind of just perpetuate polarization, and we will see that in Congress. And all of my candidates who ran on bringing Democrats and Republicans to get things done are going to be disappointed when we have lots of subpoenas and other kinds of fighting. Anyway, so I just think when we think about 2020, I think we should expect more polarization, not less polarization. And then two final points. Everyone's talking about women voters. I don't know what percentage voted. The exit poll numbers are changing. I saw 60, now I've seen 59. I don't know if other people have seen. In the Washington Post, in the battleground, which is different than national, it was about 56%. Obviously historically high numbers. And I just want to posit that that's actually a realignment that's been happening at least since the mid 2006 through 2010, and that Trump and the Republicans, in 16, kind of accelerated a realignment of women voters, but it was already in place. And in particular, and I think this is really important for the future of the parties, about 70% of women under the age of 30 voted for Democrats. 70, like that's base Democratic voting. That's Hispanic level. That's that is base level voting for Democrats. And that is a permanent realignment, in my view. That is not just a kind of, in this election, we happen to have younger women. I mean, everyone's talking about the college women, but I also think about the future of the parties. And if you look at what happened with younger women, and there's a pretty big gender gap between young men and women. And then the final point is, I think voting rights will become a national and partisan issue in a way it hasn't been before. I think that's mostly a good thing, but I think that we can expect to see a lot of shenanigans. We'll see it in Florida. We already see it with Scott sending troops to, or some kind of security force, I don't know what, to Broward County, Space Force to Broward County. But I do think that it has been a sleeper issue. I have many progressive clients that are very upset about it, and they focus a lot on voter ID, but other things as well, and always found it very hard to get voters exercised about it, besides African-American voters, and I think that's going to change. I think what happened in Georgia in particular, but also Florida, but really Georgia, I think is really going to make this a national and partisan issue in a way that it has not been in previous cycles.
Can I ask you two quick follow-up questions? I know you, we talked to you after the 2016 election, and you said you were on the ground in some state legislative races and really saw some of what was coming that the party maybe wasn't listening to. So one, maybe if you want to share a little bit more with what you heard on the ground. I think you did mention you heard some ways less ideological messages. Mm-hmm. And then second, again, 2006, Howard Dean had a 50-state strategy. It sort of worked. You had people out everywhere. Was there a sense in this election that Democrats were going to play the suburbs everywhere, or was it were the places like Oklahoma City, which kind of surprised us at the last minute, come up out of the blue, or was it more we're not going 50 states, but we're at least going suburbs that you wouldn't have thought of before? So
let me do the second one first, because it's interesting. It's not like Democrats were in control of where everybody ran. People wanted to run for Congress, and people came out of the woodwork. So I think Emily's List had like 30,000 people call them and say, I want to run for office, not just Congress, but for something. The DCCC, the day after, at least the day after the Women's March, had an unprecedented number of people call them and say, I want to run. So some of the places we won were because there were a bunch of people there who wanted to run for office, and they had competitive primaries where people raised money and ran real campaigns and got voters excited, and then became general election candidates who were actually fairly seasoned for being first-time candidates because they had competitive primaries. And so of course, we kept expanding the map in terms of where resources were sent. But I want to be clear that the number of places that contested was bottom up. I mean, and in fact, DCCC recruiting was actually a bit of a non-issue in both good and bad ways. In other words, in the good way, they didn't need to. They didn't need, they go out, Emily's List, DTRIP, all of the committees, not, go out and try to recruit people to run. Like, they didn't need to do any recruitment. And that was a pretty amazing thing. You know, it was challenging because sometimes people who wanted to run they didn't view as good general election candidates, and a few of them won primaries. But for the most part, this was a bottom-up, I want to run, and my view was let people do it. Like, don't try to get involved. Like, let people organize themselves and raise the money, and that's a real shift from what I've seen in my 20 years doing this.
All right, Nathan.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for doing this on a Friday, because I'm in a much better place than I would have been on Wednesday or Thursday. Wednesday, I was on 2 hours of sleep, and a Kind bar was my nourishment. But so now I'm back to getting as much sleep as you do with 4 kids, ages 10 and under, so I'm looking good. Well, first of all, one of the things that I'm happy about this week is that for 2 years we've been answering questions about the 2016 presidential election. Like, why didn't you see Donald Trump winning? Why didn't you see, like, for enough? Like, if this was a surprise to you on election night, like, you weren't paying attention or weren't paying attention to the right folks, because I think, at least for months, you know, we and multiple outlets have been saying Republicans are most likely to hold the Senate, Democrats are most likely to win the House, and so I'm excited to kind of hopefully move on a little bit from 2016. I've been searching for a metaphor for this, and it's always dangerous with cameras and everyone in the audience to do this live and out loud. But I've been thinking about the buffet election, that there are enough results where each party can pick and choose what you want to take and put on your plate and what you want to walk past and ignore. And I think there are more things for Democrats, as Anna spelled out and John spelled out. I think there are more things for Democrats to put on their plate, but Republicans have enough to where they can ignore those vegetables or whatever things they don't want to eat and move on. It sounds like maybe we can work with this metaphor. I'm not sure. I'll keep working on it. But I think the bottom line is a lot of this is a realignment. I mean, if we go all the way back to 2016, but looking at the Senate races, 2016 in the Senate races was the first time since we've been electing senators by the popular vote that the presidential result and the Senate results all matched up together. And I think where we saw Republicans win in the Senate races was kind of a realignment. And in the places where Democrats won in the House, a lot of Clinton districts where Republicans were holding, moving on. And I think this is, you know, it continues to be this more of a partisan vote rather than a personality vote. I mean, we saw a number of senators, I mean, to bring up Heidi Heitkamp, sorry, Mark, but, you know, Heidi Heitkamp, for years, like, you know, she's a fighter. She has her own brand. Claire McCaskill, she's a fighter. She knows how to run campaigns. Or if we flip over to the Republicans, Carlos Curbelo, he has his own brand. You know what? That didn't end up mattering. I mean, it mattered whether you're a Republican in a Democratic district or if you're a Democrat in a Republican state. I think that that's what drove things. And on election night, I feel like some of the news out of the White House was, you know, obviously declaring victory in the Senate, but don't worry about the House. We'll win it back in 2020. And I think that Republicans lost some districts that aren't coming back anytime soon. Just like I think Democrats lost some Senate seats that I'm not sure are coming back anytime soon. And because these are kind of moving into places, partisan places where they probably should have been. I mean, if we go back to 2010 and the Republican wave in 2010, Republicans picked up some southern seats that Democrats and Democrats who had brands had held on to, and those seats aren't coming back anytime soon. And so I think that the fight, Republicans might be whistling past the graveyard a bit on how easy it's going to be to take back the House, even if the actual majority is a little bit less. One thing I wanted to just talk about a little bit was polling. I don't know, there's probably divisive views, maybe even in this room, but polling gets a bad rap, and not just because I have 2 pollsters here, but I actually think the polling was pretty darn good in this election. I actually think the partisan polling was better than the public polling. Now, the Siena and New York Times, by and large, I think was in line with a lot of the partisan stuff, but part of what I try to do is not just look at the public polling, but try to get my eyes and ears on the partisan stuff. And I don't know that partisan pollsters were all that shocked about what happened, and I think they largely got it right. And so I think that that's maybe something, a counter to the narrative. I'll just keep it short. The last thing that I'll say is that I think there's a difference between what happened in this election and what the parties think happened in this election. You know, for example, I think the president believes that his strategy, talking about immigration, was successful. It delivered the Senate. He kind of dismisses the House as being because those House members didn't talk and cozy up to him that that's why they lost. And I think that that's, even though I think that's a flawed way of looking at it, particularly on the House side, if that's what he thinks happens, that's going to encourage him to continue in that behavior and talk about that.
They didn't show him any love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Mia love, the love, and they're like, no, Carlos Curbelo lost because of you, not in, because he wasn't there. But and on the Democratic side, I think it'd be interesting to see what lessons they learn. I mean, you saw some high-profile, progressive kind of champions or heroes not win, and what do the Democrats learn from that? Does that encourage Democrats to moderate? Are they going to push left? I think that's still an open question, but to reiterate that I think what the parties think happened is more important than I think what actually happened.
Great. Mark?
Thanks. Well, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it, so hence my role here. First of all, I want to say I think it was really an outstanding night for Democrats. Unless you happen to be a United States Democratic senator in the United States Senate, it was a great night. If you're a Democratic senator, you can be excused for feeling a little bit down, but in every other level, and John went through the numbers, I think didn't mention the governors, where we picked up, I believe, 7 governorships around the country, including Wisconsin, beating Scott Walker. We were involved, a number of others around the country, that some of which were, I'd say, legitimate surprises, or a surprise to many. So the reality is it was a very good night for Democrats. But I just want to underline a couple points that really have already been made in some way or other. One, what we're really witnessing here, I think, in an important measure, is the triumph of partisanship. Partisanship has become an identity, perhaps the most important political identity we have, and people voted in line with partisanship. That seems to be fundamentally true. Just to go back to Heidi Heitkamp, who was also a client of ours, the reality is 6 years ago when we won that race, Mitt Romney was winning by 20 points, won by 20 points in North Dakota, and there was a 12-point gap margin for Republicans in terms of party identification. And yet, Heidi Heitkamp was able to overcome both of those facts. By the time we got 6 years later to 2018, there's a 20-point gap in party identification. Donald Trump won the state by 36 points, as opposed to Romney's 20. So you have people moving in a red state more to the right, more to the red, more to the Republican side. And whereas in there were no exit polls in North Dakota in 2016, people didn't think it was interesting. And I mean, in 2012, people didn't think it was interesting enough. But in 2018, only about, we can assume that the last time there were at least 20% of people who voted for Romney voted for Heitkamp. This time, about 5% of Republicans ended up voting for Heidi Heitkamp. That's a picture that was repeated in Indiana, repeated in Missouri, repeated in all these other states, Senate states where Democrats did not do well. We were also involved in John Tester's race. That was the one exception. And it's an exception because the truth is Montana is not as Republican a state as any of the other 3 that I just mentioned. And that makes a difference. There's much more room for maneuver in a state like Montana than there is in North Dakota or even in Missouri. So, but again, if you look at the data, I think we are witnessing the triumph of partisanship. We're witnessing the fact that partisanship has become people's primary political identity, and people rarely diverge from their primary political identity. This was true in Wisconsin as well. It was a very close race. We won it by a point, but again, almost all the Democrats voted for Evers. Almost all the Republicans voted for Walker, and the independents split slightly towards us, and that's really what made the difference in the race. So, point 1. Point 2. It is very difficult, it is really not difficult, it's foolish, to extrapolate from the midterm election to the next presidential election. But that's what everyone's interested in at this point anyway, because we've done 2018 already. What about 2020? Well, there are a couple things that happened in 2018 that I think do matter for 2020. Again, very difficult, really foolish to extrapolate. Ronald Reagan got shellacked in 82, went on to win record landslide in 84. Barack Obama, in his first midterm, we lost over 60 seats in the House. He went on to win comfortably. So there's no straight lines here. But I think a couple things are notable. One, and that is the Midwest. The truth is, Trump would not have won without what we might call the Great Lakes states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. And if we look at what happened in those states, and those were, for the most part, very close in the presidential election. Ohio a little less close, but the others very close. If you look at what happened here, Pennsylvania reelected a Democratic governor that I think is a client of Anna's, overwhelming margin, reelected a Democratic senator. Michigan elected a Democratic governor and reelected a Democratic senator. Wisconsin, 2 Democrats. Ohio, a split decision. There's no reasonable way, and if you look at Trump's approval ratings in these states, really not very good. There's no way I think anybody can look at that and say, well, we can just assume that those Midwest states, those Great Lakes states, are going to vote for Donald Trump come 2020. And without those states, he has a very hard road to hoe, and there's not a lot of other states that are going to shift towards Donald Trump in the course of the next election. The second point goes to this about 2020 goes to this approval rating. The truth is, presidents who've done poorly in midterms have had low approval ratings, and by the time they've gotten to their presidential election, those approval ratings have risen. But the truth about those other presidents has been that their approval ratings have been much more labile, much more volatile, much more movable in the first 2 years of their term. Donald Trump's approval rating has been incredibly stable. Republicans stand up and cheer when it goes from 39 to 41, say, hey, we got those 2 points. Fantastic. But the truth is, in past presidencies, we've seen in the first 2 years 5, 10-point movements in presidential approval. We haven't seen anything like that for Donald Trump. Could it happen in the next 2 years? Absolutely it could. Is it likely to happen? I would say not very likely. The third thing I want to say, and it really goes back to states, I should have put it with the Great Lakes states, and that's Florida. Florida, obviously extremely close. We don't know who's going to win, either the Senate or the House. What we do know, the Senate or the gubernatorial election. But what we do know is this. On the same day that Florida voters really split on the Senate and gubernatorial votes, no matter how it comes out, it's a pretty even split, over 60% voted to restore voting rights to convicted felons. There are 1.4 million people in Florida who are going to be voting in 2020 that were not permitted to vote in 2018, that were not permitted to vote in 2016. Not all of them will vote. Not all of them will vote Democratic, but a lot of them will. And obviously, that's going to make a huge difference in a state that is as evenly divided as Florida. Final point I want to make is about political reform generally, and again, this was touched on. But we have seen a lot, I think, a significant movement towards political reform in lots of ways. I mentioned just now the Florida restoration of voting rights for felons, very important race. We saw in a number of states, including Michigan, the adoption of independent commissions for redistricting. There is a rebellion against politics as usual, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether you like it or you don't like it. The reality is it's happening. And that will affect our politics and will affect the House of Representatives in particular, as well as in other of these reforms, affect the White House, Senate, governor's races for a long time to come.
So, Mark teed up a couple of questions I was going to ask the panel later, at least about regions, about the Midwest, about Florida. I think I'll also ask about Texas, but I'm going to save that to get through one round here. So be ready. Henry.
Okay. So I'd like to talk about the people who I think decided the election, saved the Republicans' bacon, and the people who elected Donald Trump, the Obama-Trump voters, who in a piece today in the Washington Post I wrote, I nicknamed them Tigers. Trump is great Republicans. Figured they need a nickname. We had NASCAR dads, soccer moms, now we've got Tigers. So let's take a look at what happened in the Senate races. If you take a look at Indiana, North Dakota, and Missouri, and you only look at the large cities and their suburbs, all 3 Democrats should have been reelected. That the swings for Donnelly, McCaskill, and Heitkamp from their total in 2012 in Indianapolis, Hamilton, Monroe, and Tippecanoe, the college towns and the big cities, was not enough of a drop for Donnelly to lose. McCaskill, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Boone County, Kansas City, Clay, Platte, and Jackson, she actually, and even Springfield, Greene County, her margins do not drop by enough from how she beat Todd Akin to lose. And the same is true even for Heidi. Look at Grand Forks, was it the two big counties in the east? Fargo and Grand Forks. She does not drop significantly enough to lose. All of them lost because of small town and rural swings that were massive. And that only happens because you had people who 6, 8, 10 years ago were open to voting for a Democrat, who are not open to voting for a Democrat now, vote partisanly, and that's a change that Donald Trump did. Why did John Tester win? John Tester had Matt Rosendale only done as badly as Denny Rayburg did in Missoula and Gallatin, which is Bozeman and Park County. He would have beaten John Tester because of the rural swing. Tester actually improved his margins against Rosendale in those kind of, I think Lewis and Clark and Cascade was kind of the same, but I think he also improved in Lewis and Clark County. I'm saying this because I've got Tester's pollster next to me. So what I'm saying is that the only silver lining for the Republicans was because of voters that they have not been able to get absent Donald Trump. Take a look also at Mike DeWine and Mike DeWine's victory. You compare Mike DeWine's victory in Ohio to John Kasich's narrow victory in 2010. He picks up those extra couple of votes in the working class districts, in Mahoning, in Trumbull, in Ashtabula County, in the coal counties down on the Ohio River. So what that suggests is that the Tigers came home. They weren't just a personal loyalty to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, through his efforts, transferred a large amount of that loyalty to Republican candidates. So what does that mean going forward? Well, first of all, in the House, the Republican Party, in my view, inexplicably failed to challenge most Democrats holding Obama-Trump seats. If you take a look, there are at least 5 seats where there was no significant national involvement that were either Romney-Trump districts or Obama-Trump districts held by Democrats. In each case, the Republican got between 46 and 48% of the vote with no national effort. Imagine a national party that decides that, hey, you know, instead of letting a Wall Street banker move into a rural Obama-Trump district, Pennsylvania 10, Matt Cartwright, we actually try and like maybe get a local representative and target that seat. You know, that seat would have gone, in my view, the way that the Duluth seat and the Rochester seat, two Minnesota Obama-Trump Democratic-held seats that Republicans both picked up. I think that would have been another gain. You take a look at Colin Peterson, Mr. Popular, in a Romney-Trump district, and nobody gets 47.5%. Yeah, he's popular, but this is a partisan age. All you had to do was knock on the door, and I think western Minnesota might have fallen. And then you take a look at all the House seats that they did manage to hold off. You know, Troy Balderson, not Danny O'Connor, is going to come because as much as Columbus and the Delaware County suburbs swung to the Democrats, the Obama-Trump voter in the other rural and smaller town countries stuck with Troy Balderson. So the question is, does the Republican Party want to try and turn back the clock and say we've always represented rich people, we should always want to represent rich people? Or does the Republican Party look and say, you know, the voters who actually want to be part of our party are a different type of person, and maybe we should actually invite them to join us? You know, that's what Ronald Reagan did in 1980. I remember Teddy White's last book, In Search of History. He did The Making of the President, and finally in 1980, he knew it was going to be his last book. So he did Making of the President, but he put it in a historical conception and called it In Search of History. And there's an anecdote there where he's at the Reagan Victory Party in the 1980 primary, the June California primary. And he goes up to Lynn Nofziger, the political director, or the press secretary at the time for the campaign, and he says, this is the frowsiest crowd of frumps I have ever seen at a victory party, because it's people who are not wearing, you know, tailored suits and fine cocktail dresses. And Nofziger said, that's our constituency, the great unwashed middle class. And that's who wants to join the Republican Party today, the great unwashed working class, to move it one step down. And the Republican Party has to ask, do they want them? Donald Trump wants them, and Donald Trump gets them. Part of Donald Trump's problem is he doesn't get the traditional Republican and is driving them away. So he is driving away voters as he is adding them. But the way we elect presidents is the Electoral College. And if I were Donald Trump, I would look and I would say, I'm going to hold, looks like I'm going to hold in an election where the Democrats presumably still turned out in larger numbers than Republicans, although Republican turnout was great, in an election where independents across the board tilted towards the Democrats. They still look like they will run even in Arizona, carry Georgia, run well in Florida, win Ohio, win Iowa, and come within a fraction of a percent in Wisconsin. And it looks like they may very well hold Maine too. You flip Wisconsin, hold all of those states, hold Maine too, that's 270 Electoral College votes. On the existing vote that happened last night, which I think is probably about as pro-democratic of a vote as you can get. Now, I can imagine a time when, I can imagine a scenario where Trump's approval rating goes down, that the Mueller report just, ticks people off, or he, it actually finds evidence of wrongdoing. I can imagine an international crisis that goes the wrong way. I can imagine a recession. I can also imagine a Democratic Congress that can't hold back its base and is viewed as the aggressor in a partisan war, turning off some of those independents who want problem solving. I can imagine a Donald Trump who doesn't stop being a fighter but starts being a more polite fighter and slowly wins back some of those independents. I can even a Donald Trump, Donald Trump's loyalty to his subordinates is legendary. So I can imagine a Donald Trump who in June goes to Mike Pence and says, I don't need you anymore, thank you very much. The next Vice President of the United States is going to be Nikki Haley. And what does a suburbanite do when suddenly the next president of the United States, Donald Trump goes up and says, I think the person who should succeed me in case I had one cheeseburger too many is a woman of color. You guys try and run against that. And so what I'm trying to say is that it was a very good night for Democrats. It was a very good night for Democrats in large part because of Donald Trump. But there are real silver linings that if the party is willing to embrace them rather than resist them, means that the opportunity for re-election, things moving slightly in a Republican direction for President Trump are actually pretty good. And that we should not ignore the people who live outside of the major metropolitan areas because they cast votes, they're equal to us, and they have their feelings, and they were heard.
Thank you. So I thought Henry was going with it when you were bringing up the Wisconsin scenario. I thought you were going for the Electoral College tie scenario, which people have been talking about. And I just as somebody
that's why I threw in Maine too, because that's what gets you to 270.
Right, exactly. And as
but let's not forget New Hampshire. New Hampshire was the closest state last time. Chris Sununu won. You have a tiny fraction of vote change, and Donald Trump doesn't have to win Maine too. Then it's at 273.
But as somebody who wrote a book on the Electoral College, the tie scenario is not so bad for me. After the people vote, you can find it on Amazon. And bad for the country, no doubt, but it would be interesting. So, but I previewed it. I think Henry did a good job of maybe bucking up the other side, the Midwest. Midwest is a key swing region. There are changes going on, I think, in both directions. I think both parties could point to some parts, and maybe I'll include Pennsylvania as I don't know if you want to call it the Midwest or the Rust Belt. But tell us about what happened in the Midwest and what the future of the Midwest means for the future of our politics. Because there are some, as I say, I think there's some good news on both sides of that, and some trends are going both ways.
You want us to go down, or
well, just to jump in.
I think it's mixed bag. I thought that I do a pre-election prediction memo, and I did pretty well, but my biggest error was Midwestern governors. I believed the public polls. I thought Republicans were going to lose Ohio and Iowa, and the reason they didn't is because of the Obama-Trump voter coming back. I don't know if they were private polls were picking that up better than the publicly available polls, but you take a look in the Midwest, and I can see. I think it will be a battleground that these states remain much more blue-collar, white-heavy. That the sort of person who's made the election a blue night is less likely to live in suburban Cincinnati, where margins did not drop off very much. Metro Cincinnati did not look like most of the other metro areas. You've got a lot of Metro Milwaukee did not look like a lot of the other metro areas. There was some rhino moderate move off, but Walker still carries suburban Milwaukee extremely well. And I think it's going to be the battleground, and unless the Democrats think that what happened in Georgia, Texas, and Arizona can be both built upon and expanded with a new push in 2020, I think they're going to have to figure out in the nominee, who are we going to nominate that gives a good contrast to Donald Trump with these Midwestern blue-collar voters, because there aren't enough high-income suburbanites to move those states irretrievably into their column. And if they once again have a nominee who is utterly unpersuasive to these people, I think you could see, particularly with a lot of Republican conservatives who in 2016 didn't like Trump because they didn't think he was conservative enough, the sort of person who voted for Evan McMullin or Gary Johnson, those people are actually pretty happy with Donald Trump now. They wish he wouldn't tweet, but tax cuts and judges. So I think you'd see some addition to Trump's standing there. And if they nominate somebody who is unpersuasive to the Obama-Trump tiger, then I think there's a good opportunity for an electoral college victory. And so I would expect it to be the battleground again in 2020.
Anna, do you want to say something about
I'm actually more interested in the South.
Okay. Well, all right. I was going to go 2 places in the South. I could go to Florida, but how about Texas? Nobody's talked about Texas, and the name Beto O'Rourke has not come up, and the what, since he did so well, perhaps unfair charge was that most of his supporters were probably half of this audience with their yard signs in Bethesda rather than the local. Texas, obviously, Democrats did incredibly well across the board. So what?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the context is Arizona, Texas, Georgia. These are all states that are growing, have growing suburbs, and have growing minority populations. And I know everyone on my side who loves Stacey Abrams was gutted. I can't believe that an African-American woman in a midterm against someone who actually was running and I believe trying to steal an election actually got to where she did in that race. And so I know that's small comfort when you lose, but it's pretty extraordinary. If you look at Texas and how Beto did, I mean, Wendy Davis got, I think, about 31% of the vote in 2014. So for Beto to get, what did he get, 48, 49? I mean, is incredible. And I think that, it looks good for Kristen Sinema. Obviously, where the ballots are outstanding are more Democratic parts of Arizona. And so I have no doubt the Midwest is going to be deeply, deeply contested. But I actually think some of these states are going to also be deeply contested. If you can do that well in a midterm with candidates who are unabashedly progressive. Kristen Sinema is, openly, I don't know what she calls herself, is bisexual. I'm not sure what. I mean, in a conservative state like Arizona. So I think that is going to be part of the new battleground. Do I think that a Democrat can win Texas at a presidential? Probably not. But it's still pretty extraordinary how Democrats did. And again, it's population growth. It's growing suburban areas. It is growing minority population, not just Hispanics, right? If you look at the AAPI vote. That has shifted dramatically in a Democratic direction. I remember in the early 2000s, Asian American voters were split 50-50. It's now 70-30, right? So I think that's the more, in some ways, the more interesting part of what happened in 2018 as it relates to 2020. And I mean, it's clear what happened in Texas. Huge turnout in cities. I think it was late, but I think we'll see. I mean, we don't have updated voter file yet, but I think when we do, we'll be able to see that there was, real turnout among Hispanic voters in Texas. There's a massive drop in Hispanic turnout in midterms in Texas. I've had the unfortunate experience of polling in Texas 23 in two different cycles and watching, the drop off between 2012 and 2014 in Hispanic voting in that district. I know that race isn't called yet. I don't think she'll win, but the fact that Will Hurd, who I think is probably one of the best Republicans out there in terms of what he represents for the party, could almost lose that seat. To a woman who is openly gay and half Filipino. I mean, it is. So I think that there was probably a tremendous boost in Hispanic, turnout in the state as well, and that has been the promise of Texas turning purple. Again, will it happen in 2020? I don't know, but you are actually finally seeing the signs of Texas turning purple in this election.
Anyone else?
I think in Beto's loss, I mean, just last night, Colin Allred was on CNN basically giving credit, not all credit, but to him for helping him defeat Pete Sessions. I think it's a large reason why Culberson lost. I mean, at least the turnout that he kind of the tide lifting all boats.
That was an excellent campaign that Lizzie Fletcher ran.
She ran a credible campaign and won a competitive primary as well. And just to go back to specifically on Texas 32, I think that was kind of a microcosm of the cycle. And you have a Republican who ran unopposed in 2016, and then you had at least five credible Democratic candidates coming in to run against him this time. Competitive primary, Allred ends up winning, but a suburban district that hadn't really been contested a lot before, and then Democrats end up winning it. And I think that's a microcosm. What I'm interested in Texas going forward is redistricting. It looks like Republicans will be in charge of redistricting, but how do they account for these demographic changes and drawing a map that doesn't just make sense for 2022, but will not only be upheld by the courts, but last for an entire decade? Because I think that's, we're at the end of a decade now. We're seeing where these maps, it's tough to draw a map that lasts, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see how Republicans try to handle that.
I just, again, underline what Anna said. These states in the South and West are moving in our direction very clearly. Nevada already got there, essentially. Arizona is behind, Texas farther behind, Georgia a little behind, but they're all moving in the same direction, which long term is good for us. Is it going to be by 2020? We have no idea. I have no idea, at least, whether that's going to be the case, but it's certainly possible. But just two macro points here that I think are worth at least considering. One is, when you think about it, whether it's the Great Lakes states or whether it's these South and West states, there are a number of states that voted for Donald Trump that are going to be extremely vulnerable in 2020. That is to say, where it's extremely possible to see Democrats take those states. There is not one state that voted for Hillary Clinton that you can reasonably say, oh, that's going to switch to Trump. Okay? So that creates a much better environment, I think, for the Democrats going into 2020 than it does for the Republicans. Second point is this. Democrats have long talked about increasing turnout, and if you increase turnout, we're going to do better. And Stacey Abrams' campaign fundamental strategy was to say, look, there are not very many swing voters in Georgia. The only way we're going to win this is by juicing up turnout. I would argue that one of the lessons from from Georgia, from Texas, is it is very hard to do what you need to do. And Georgia had turnout that was, I think, 95% of presidential level. I mean, it was almost presidential level turnout. But it's very difficult to do what you need to do to stimulate Democratic turnout without stimulating Republican turnout. And so the notion that you're just going to get the Democrats to turn out by running some kind of campaign, and the Republicans are going to ignore that, I think that has sort of been put to bed.
Yeah, I don't disagree with respect to the South. That clearly the demographic trends are moving in Democrats' directions in all of those states. But if you have to choose between gambling on the South or competing for the Midwest, I think competing for the Midwest is the safer strategy. From a Democratic perspective, it'd be better to move for both. But it's not clear to me that you'll have a candidate that you can plausibly say can do that. We'll find out. But I'd still say, for most of these states, it is still strongly leaning in the Republicans' favor in the short term. And I think that you take a look. This was a year that, for a lot of reasons, independents tilted to Democrats. It's not clear to me that even if independents are really only 10 or 15%, their movement does seem to be the thing that determines who wins and who loses. And it's not at all clear to me that they were for Trump narrowly in 2016, for Obama in 2012, in many places. I think that it's not clear to me that that's locked in stone. And so consequently, I would say you may have seen a high water mark for the Democrats in the South on Tuesday, rather than something that is there and then you can leap over it further in 2020. It may very well be that for the short term, you've seen a high water mark in the South, and consequently close but no cigar.
So let me ask about, here's the state. We should always talk about Florida, and here's the mystery that I'll put on the table. I think we knew the Democrats were going to do well, that the general electorate was going to shift in their favor by, you name the percentage. Generic ballot could show 7 or 8%, maybe it was 4 or 5%, but almost every state we're talking about, there was some shift in the Democratic direction. Even the big states, if there hadn't been a midterm with a Republican president, Indiana would have been much more, and so would have Missouri. So, but Florida arguably didn't. Right? Florida, Donald Trump won by one percentage point, and it's going to end up a tie essentially in the two big state races. Whoever wins, it's statistically a tie. Why did Republicans do as well as they did in Florida? Is it candidate specific? Is it Florida is is it that Donald Trump has a place in Mar-a-Lago? No, that's not it. But so why did Republicans do better in Florida?
Latinos. Both Scott and DeSantis did significantly better among Puerto Ricans and Cubans, and that made up for some additional moves in the Democratic favor. Take a look at Osceola County, which is the only county in America with a plurality of people who identify Puerto Rican ancestry as their ancestry, and Scott and DeSantis significantly outran Donald Trump, and combined with the partisanship that we've talked about earlier among whites largely holding up and African Americans largely holding up. I think if they do prevail, it will be because of their improvement in the Cuban and the Puerto Rican communities. Democrats still won the Puerto Rican communities, but by smaller margins than Hillary Clinton did, and that'll prove to be the difference.
Scott he actually went to Puerto Rico, right, and actually did a lot around Puerto Rico, and I think more than Nelson did, which may be part of.
Ron DeSantis didn't.
Right, but just looking at that Senate race, I mean, he was very, very smart, Scott.
And I come back to partisanship. Democrats won the 2 South Florida seats that Hillary Clinton carried, but they were also reaching for a few other Trump districts. Ron DeSantis' seat, Rooney's seat in the 15th district. In both of those races, the Democratic candidate significantly outspent the Republican candidate, but I think the partisanship of the district prevailed. It showed that money, in Texas is another good example, that there are some partisan problems that money can't fix. And so I think Florida might count as 3 states in terms of, depending on what region you're talking about, but partisanship prevailed.
1.4 million new voters, very disproportionately Democrat going forward, different state.
The other thing to point out is that 7% of Floridians were taken off the rolls, that the Republicans in Florida have been much more aggressive around cleaning off the voter rolls than in other states. And so, 7% is a lot. And I'm sure some of them were actually dead and other things and moved. I'm not saying they all are inappropriately removed, but it's still a very high number. And so I just go back to voting rights and voter suppression, and I think that's a real thing in Florida. It really is.
Okay, we are going to turn to you, and we have some mics coming. And what I ask is you identify yourselves and ask a question, the 2 things that we always want. So why don't we start right here in the middle?
Thank you. Rob Palmer from Madison, Wisconsin, and so I would like to talk to Mark about what he missed in Wisconsin, which I'm okay with. So clearly, Tammy Baldwin, I stopped counting at 10%, and Scott Walker barely lost. All the statewide Republican offices barely lost. Yet in Wisconsin's 1st district, where you had a very highly funded Democratic candidate, lost, I think, by 9 points. And in the state Senate, Republicans actually won back a seat they had lost in a special election, and Republicans held the assembly without a loss. So there's some real dichotomy there in a state where you knocked off a very well-known, not necessarily popular governor, and everybody thought that Paul Ryan's seat was in play. I would argue that Tuesday night proved that it was not in play. So I'd like to hear kind of your counter-arguments. What are the other trends in Wisconsin? What did you miss?
I don't think we missed anything. I wasn't involved in those other races. But look, I think there's no question that there was a certain level of exhaustion with Scott Walker, who had been a very divisive figure. And while clearly the man survived 3 previous elections. So clearly a majority of people were not opposed to him in principle, but he had been a divisive character, and people are a little tired of it. There's just no question about that. So, and Tony Evers was actually a great candidate, suited for a great time, in the sense that education was a major concern in the state, in part because of what Scott Walker did to the schools. And Tony obviously comes from an education background, was the superintendent of schools, state superintendent of schools. So he was sort of fit for the time in a very important way. So I'm not suggesting that Wisconsin is, become an overwhelmingly Democratic state. It's not. But it is the case that at the top of the ticket and down the ticket, by small margins, Democrats prevailed. Wisconsin is not, for the reasons were suggested, Waukesha County does not look like, Alexandria, Virginia. I mean, in any way, shape, or form. So there are differences in the way Wisconsin operates. I think that a lot of the candidate in the Ryan seat raised a lot of money. He was a character and used his character very well to win money, to raise money. But I'm not sure too many people really expected him to win. He probably did, expected himself to win, I don't know. That's not a seat that anyone should have counted on to begin with. But, Democrats did, to my knowledge, win up and down the ballot at small margins, but up and down the ballot.
Okay, we'll go right here. Since we have 2 pollster political scientists on the panel, we thought we'd turn to another pollster political scientist in the audience. So.
I'm David Mackleby, Brigham Young University. I'm interested in your comments on fundraising and spending in 2018 and what the lessons learned are for candidates, party committees, and outside groups, specifically super PACs. On the candidate side, when you look at the O'Rourke example and the Heitkamp example in terms of quick fundraising at particular moments, is there an advantage to one party or the other now in that world? Party committees, there's more funds available because of some changes in the court decision, McCutcheon, and other ways. And then the super PACs, they became involved. They're competing billionaires on both sides. A lot of money can come in quickly. As you looked at the races, did money matter in 2018?
Well, money was very interesting this cycle. Both the actual fundraising that occurred at the level of the candidate and the committees and the super PACs, but also the role that money played as an issue in some of these campaigns. What was really striking, there were a number of things that are really striking. I do think that really starting with Howard Dean, Democrats have always had a better kind of small dollar sort of, it's always seemed to have been a little more energy on the small dollar fundraising. I think Trump actually raised a fair amount of small dollar, just by sort of who he was and how he ran. But I think generally speaking, there tends to be a little bit more of a small dollar donor advantage on the Democratic side, and that was sort of on steroids this cycle. Kim Schreier in Washington 8 at one point was raising $90,000 a day online, not doing anything. Okay, so I mean that's just sort of astonishing. Dean Phillips, who I worked for, had 60,000 donors, and so and those are just the ones I was involved in, right? I mean, I don't know the details of the other ones, but watching those small dollars with very little effort come in, and what it gave, I think, these Democratic candidates 2 advantages over the Republicans. One, I think it was really important for Dean, but for others, was to turn down corporate PAC money. To say there's now, we have these conversations about whether or not we should take corporate PAC money, and I was like, corporate PACs don't give to us. It's like not a big deal to say no, I'm not going to take it, because like if you really, I mean, it's not. We get very, and not only that, there are very few we would take. We're not going to take pharmaceutical. We're not going to take tobacco. Like there's all these things you're not going to take anyway. So to me, it's sort of both at the level of good policy and moral values, a good idea to not take corporate PAC money. But the truth is, it also doesn't hurt Democrats very much to not take it. And so you have, this kind of, I'm not suggesting that this was the biggest issue for voters, but you're starting to have Democratic candidates, and there were at least, I think, about 10 of them, who said, I'm not taking any corporate PAC money. And one of the ways that we ran against Eric Paulson in Minnesota 3 was to talk about the fact that he had, I think he went up from 6th to 5th most special interest corporate money of anybody in Congress, and then tying that really closely to who he took the money from. And I think that contrast, if Democrats are able to harness the small dollar which a lot of it's just completely organic, just like the people running for office. If that continues, I think that becomes a really, really big difference between Democrats and Republicans. I wanted someone to write more stories about what percentage of corporate, how many individual donors Republicans have versus Democrats in these races. And it's really like astonishing. I think Mario Diaz-Balart had like 7% of his money was under $200 for donations, something like that. He was actually, I think, the worst in all of Congress in terms of, I mean, so what you have these like Republican incumbents who are in these safe seats who never raise a dime from people. They just raise them from PACs. And I just think that in the end is a really limited strategy for winning these elections. So I hope and expect that dynamic, to at least the level, to continue. The other thing I would say is that I do think there are limits to money. Everybody here on the panel talked about partisanship trumping sort of spending, and I think that is true to a large degree. But I think the challenge is that we have sort of, this is like a mutually assured destruction kind of situation where you cannot not meet what other people are doing in these competitive races. You don't know what will happen if you decide not to. Now, Dean Phillips was outspent 4-1 and won by double digits. So it certainly is possible to win big when you're outspent. But it is hard at like this gut level, either as a party committee or a candidate, to allow yourself to get outspent. So I expect to see more and more and more money in 2020 from outside groups, especially now that we finally have some progressive billionaires who want to give money to super PACs, which had not been true really previous to this cycle, certainly not to the degree to which we saw this cycle. But I also expect it to have diminishing returns. And so really what's going to happen is people who live in swing states and districts are going to lose their minds because ads are going to start like, in February of 2019.
It's surprising to get a question on money and politics from David McAbee, I will say that. But David writes on this subject quite extensively for those that don't know. There's no question that on the Democratic side, fundraising has been democratized in a huge way. And it's not just the PACs and so on. Big donors play a much smaller role relative to small donors. And it's just become a fact. So everybody's budget, almost everybody's budget, ended up being much higher than they had anticipated because they got this money from ordinary folks. However, as we were talking about before we came on, it's not always optimally timed. So, for example, Heidi Heitkamp raised, as you alluded to, about $14 million in a matter of a month. But it was the last month. We could have used some of that $14 million before the last month and used it a little bit more effectively. There are a lot of candidates, I think, who will be sitting on significant amounts of cash because they got the money on Friday and on Saturday and on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday after the election. It was still rolling in. And there's just no way to spend it usefully at that point. Literally, I can't tell you the number of races we were in where we got, and your home district being one of them, where we got extra money in and said, okay, what can we do with it? And literally the answer was nothing. There is no TV left to buy. There is no digital left to buy. There is no radio left to buy. And mail has already gone out. Literally, there's nothing you can do with it. You can't hire people to be in the field. There's literally nothing you can do with it. You could pass it out on street corners, but that would be illegal. It's ill-timed. I will say, on the other hand, you have a guy like Tony Evers who would not have won without this. I think it's fair to say. And the reality is we sat there, we had a big primary. Nobody raised anything in the primary because everybody said, A, Scott Walker can't be beaten, and B, there's so many of you people, how am I going to decide who to give money to? So I'm not giving money to anybody. We thought we were going to go into a general election literally spending a couple of $1 million. Okay. Tony Evers raised $1 million a week for most of the period of the general election. And without that money, I don't think he would have won. And he raised it from, mostly from small individuals.
So a lot of Republicans around town are thinking, how do we found Act Red, meaning a counterpart to Act Blue? Anything particular about Act Blue and that motive?
I mean, President Trump, he drove turnout in this election. He drove fundraising in this election. I mean, he takes credit for some things he probably doesn't deserve. But he should take credit for, I think, a lot of the Democratic fundraising. I mean, they had some inspiring people, inspiring candidates who used social media and viral videos and really captured it, but the inspiration, I think, behind the donors. One fallout, I think, from the Democratic fundraising that we'll see going forward is that I think the decrease in the power of the party committees, the DSCC and the DCCC, because you know, for decades, the way that the party committees controlled things was the money. They're like, you know, give to that candidate, don't give to that candidate. But now candidates will say, who cares? I can build my own list. I'm going to do my own video, and I'll run against you. I'll run as the anti-establishment candidate. So, you know, one of the consequences of the inspiration of President Trump on the Democratic side is I think you have more candidates, more money, and you're going to have more primaries. I personally, it sounds like Anna's on the same page. I don't believe that primaries have to be bad. I think they can be a net positive, but Democrats are not used to having messy primaries, and I think there are just going to be more and more of them in the near future.
Okay. Why don't we go right here? Oh, no, right there, sorry.
Thank you. I'll stand up so you can see me. My name is Walter Tejada. I'm with Tejada Consulting Service. I do a lot of Spanish language political commentary. So like everybody else in here, I'm very enjoy this discussion. My question is overall on the Latino vote in this midterm election that we just had. Do you have any numbers yet on what percentages may have been anywhere? Going into the election, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials was forecasting about just under 8 million Latino voters will show up at this midterm election as compared to 2014, which are about 6 million. So like 7.8 million was supposed to vote in this election. So do you have any numbers yet on that? And no, it's hard to digest it because it just happened. And so, you know, look for more analysis on that. And some people would not necessarily accept that the Puerto Rican vote went in large number for Scott, for example. To his credit, as it was mentioned, he did travel to Puerto Rico. So that symbolically sends some message. And Nelson probably didn't do as much as he should have, symbolically anyhow. So yeah, that might have some effect. I think people will generally accept that the Cuban vote may in fact remain remain Republican and so on, but not the Puerto Rican vote. So I'd be interested in knowing a little more about that as well. But do you have any other numbers nationally yet, and any specific examples where in tight races a lot of times it's said that a particular constituency could decide a race? The Latino vote is cited many times as one of the groups that could do that. Any examples, any reactions on that?
Well, I don't have any numbers, but I'll give you some quick examples. Some of the races aren't done yet, but I'm old enough to remember when Orange County, California, was the center of Republicanism in the world, okay? It is now going to be mostly Democratic, and that's importantly a result of Latino voters. So you can find lots of races around the country where Latino voters will have made the difference. If Democrats win Arizona, Christensen wins Arizona, clearly going to be the case there. So there's lots and lots of those examples, but I don't have any numbers on the actual turnout.
I don't either yet, so.
Okay, why don't we go right here in the front? You, yep.
Hello, is this on? Yes. Oh. I'm Sally Kornfeld from Virginia, and I was an election official. And one thing that was surprising to me or unsettling to me was how few young people came to vote. We had great turnout in my precinct, but the Virginia licenses go the opposite way if you're under a certain age, under 21. And many of the people that did come that had those licenses were pushing 25. So I was wondering if there's any statistics on under 25 voters or under 21 voters and what that looks like for the future and how one might even target to get those people to come out if they didn't come out this time with the Florida gun activists, et cetera.
I thought you were going to say you should come to my Arlington precinct, but if you're using 25 as the cutoff, actually that's probably not true. I have sort of older millennials.
Again, I mean, part of the problem, part of the reason we don't have turnout numbers yet is like we're not done counting votes in a lot of places, and so I think, and we will know a lot about it because the two pieces of information that are on voter files are gender and age. So either that's actually, you can know definitively what percentage of the electorate was, you know, that age group, and we don't have that yet. But in the early vote, there was actually a lot of evidence of increased turnout among millennials and under 30 voters. And so if you looked at the age distribution, there was higher turnout among everyone, but in certain states it was a 300% increase in turnout among under 30, and then it would be 200 among 30 to 40, and then you'd have 50% among people over 65, right? So everyone went up, but there was disproportionate increase in younger voters turning out to vote early. And I think there's at least some anecdotal evidence, you know, from exit polls that millennial turnout was up. I don't see how you get to the kind of turnout rates that we had without it being also driven by millennials. I think equally important was that 67% of millennials voted Democratic, so almost at that 70% number. And that's, I mean, even Barack Obama got about, I shouldn't say millennials versus, they're two different things, right? But millennials are younger voters. Right, millennials are a generation, if you will, and there's younger voters. But if we take younger voters, and let's just define it that way, Obama got about 65. In other words, they actually did better. I mean, they were more Democratic this year than they did in 2008. And it was a pretty dramatic shift. In fact, in 2012, Obama lost white voters under the age of 30. And I haven't looked at it by race specifically, but I feel pretty confident Democrats probably won white under 30 voters. So there's some really interesting dynamics, and I think there's better numbers than you saw in your precinct, but I don't know the exact numbers yet.
Okay, I'm going to go here.
I'm Kumar. I'm unaffiliated, except I've canvassed for Democrats in past elections and this election. And the carpools I went in, they were full of young voters, Gen X and Gen Z. So I thought the younger voters really participated.
Yeah, I am too. I felt good about that. But
I was really surprised at how many young voters there were in the carpools. In fact, there's one woman from Michigan who was passing through D.C., and she learned we were going out, and she said she wanted to participate. So I don't know what impact young voters would have in future elections, but if they did, I would think the Democrats would do well.
I mean, I guess another way of putting it is this. I mean, the younger voters, each cohort votes less at a lower percentage than others. That's been true. But there's actually even much more fall-off in a midterm election than there is in presidential. So those voters not only are lowest voting in the presidential, but they fall off significantly. So we'll have to see. But good. Don? Yeah. You have a mic here? Or, sorry.
Don Wolfensberger, a fellow here at BPC. About a month ago, there was a lot of speculation about what impact the whole Kavanaugh nomination imbroglio would have on the midterms, yet no mention was made today or any of the post-election analysis that I've seen. Was it a factor at all that, from what you can gauge?
I think I'm answer it in two ways. On the one hand, these elections always sort of get in line with the fundamentals at some point. We always ascribe it to some event. Oh, it was the debate, or Dukakis in the tank, or Kavanaugh, or whatever. And, you know, but when you're always ascribing it to some event, you got to worry that that's not really what's happening. So it's not clear that that happened. The thought at the time was, or the appearance at the time was, that it did increase support for Republicans, increase the enthusiasm of Republicans. Whether all that really mattered in the end is hard to know. In some places, I think it did have an impact. I'll just speak to North Dakota. There are a lot of people. I mean, part of the argument of a Democrat running in a state like North Dakota is, I'm independent. I do what's right for my state. I'm not just a slave of national Democrats. A lot of people in North Dakota said, I'm looking at that Kavanaugh vote as an indicator of that. If you vote for Kavanaugh, then you're not just a national Democrat. You're really independent. If you vote against Kavanaugh, you're really just a national Democrat. And in the end, because of the sexual harassment allegations, Heidi Heitkamp felt she had to vote against Kavanaugh. But there is no question that that had a significant impact on her support, but not because of Kavanaugh per se, but because it was symbolic of a much larger issue about her independence, or perceived independence.
Okay, over here.
Hello, I'm Larry Rudwick from Virginia. One state that did not come up was West Virginia, and I may have didn't hear everything, but my understanding was that all the states that voted heavily for Trump, the Dems lost. Is Joe Manchin simply an exception to that rule, or did I miss something? And also, is there some lessons that the Dems can learn from that? Secondly, concerning the midterms, if Obama received a shellacking and W received a thumping, did Trump receive a trumping? You don't have to answer that.
I think Senator Manchin was fortunate to not face a better opponent. I mean, just looking at the margins, I mean, he's proven he has a brand. Everyone knows Joe Manchin. But, I mean, if you would have told me 6 months ago that Joe Manchin would have a lower percentage than John Tester, I'm not sure I would have agreed. And I think that Patrick Morrisey, the Republican, I mean, deeply unpopular, ran for Congress in New Jersey, you know, but came within 3 points. You know, if the Republicans had nominated someone else, he might be lumped in the same group as Heidi Heitkamp and Donnelly McCaskill.
And just a quick note, he did vote for Kavanaugh, demonstrating to some West Virginians that independence, and that's a brand that he really cultivated with much more, shall we say, vigor than other people have when you sort of shoot a gun at the health care bill, as he did 6 years ago. I mean, that you know, sorry?
Cap and trade bill.
Cap and trade, sorry, cap and trade bill. You know, it sends a very strong signal. And he had been governor, obviously, before that, where he also sent some very strong signals. So, you know, the reality is he's a unique figure in many ways.
Okay, now we'll go here.
Hi, thanks so much for presenting. My name is Marissa. I'm from Kansas, and I want to talk a little bit about Kansas since that hasn't been mentioned yet. So Kansas was a state that went for Trump, but we just elected a Democratic governor against Chris Kobach, very well-known figure now on the national stage. Could you guys speak a little bit to the partisan versus, when one of you earlier was speaking, yeah, just about partisanship becoming more of the political identity, but then Kansas electing a Democratic governor and one Democratic rep, Sharice Davids.
So what's no longer the matter with Kansas is the question. So to paraphrase a famous book.
Republicans have been involved in a civil war between moderate and conservative factions there for well over a decade. It's centered in suburban Kansas City, Johnson County. That's the seat that flipped. It's the seat that unseated a lot of Republican incumbents a couple of years ago in favor of moderates who overrode then Governor Brownback's veto of his tax cuts, which the override of the veto meant that the tax cuts were repealed. And then you take a look at Kobach, and he not only lost Johnson County, he lost Sedgwick County, which is Wichita. It was yet again a question of the cities versus the rural areas, and I think Kobach's, he too had a very strong, narrowly won primary. He, I think, struck a lot of urban and suburban Republican moderates as being the wrong type of person. And of course, how many did every Republican former governor living besides Brownback endorse?
I didn't know there were that many former Kansas governors until he started.
Well, there was at least a couple
started rolling
who did.
it out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it helped. They have a long-running, very bitter battle between the two factions there, and moderates are very strong there institutionally. And I think that came back to bite Kobach, and that's one, a harbinger of intra-Republican difficulties, but I terribly doubt that signifies that Kansas is in play when you get to the national Democrat versus Donald Trump question, because clearly in order to be somebody who runs in Kansas, you have to be one of those centrist Democrats who are amenable to representing Kansas concerns as opposed to being a national Democrat. And anyone who wins the national Democratic nomination is going to be a national Democrat, and that's going to drive partisan, moderate Republicans often holding their nose behind Donald Trump. At least in sufficiently large numbers, that's not going to be in play.
Just think about it. Sam Brownback objectively brought the state of Kansas to near ruin. I mean, but that's well, look, almost everybody in Kansas thinks that's the case.
Well, I always think ruin means like Venezuela. I mean, there aren't 100,000 Kansas fleeing for Iowa. But yeah, no, I mean, the budget was a disaster.
And so you have that, and then you have Chris Kobach being one of the biggest jerks in the world. And those two things combined created problems.
One thing stuck out to me was the 2nd district race, the Lynn Jenkins open seat, where I think by most standards, Democrats had the better candidate. Maybe all Democrat, but that's still a Republican district, and I think that ultimately was why Paul Davis didn't win, even though he had a lot of things going for him.
I mean, I think that if they'd had a different candidate, I think Paul Davis was a good candidate, but I think if they'd had a first-time candidate who didn't have a record, it might have been a little bit. I mean, I worked for House Majority PAC in that district. I wasn't working in the race for the candidate. But the tax hit, ironically, given Brownback and all that, the tax hit on Davis with some actual real votes that you could cite, because there's no question that Watkins was one of the worst candidates and is going to be very interesting to watch in Congress. He's very strange. But I think if you'd had a strong first time, didn't have a record, it would have been a little harder to. But I think there's just too many Republicans in that district. But I also think he carries the baggage of having been an elected Democrat in office in Kansas.
Well, many people say we have a permanent campaign, so we're going to wrap up this session here. We will certainly be back. We'll give you a little break. We'll give you at least a year's break, but we'll be back with panels looking at the 2020 election. I want to thank Anna Greenberg, Nathan Gonzalez, Mark Melman, and Henry Olson.